I wanted to offer to you this morning a Christian response to coronavirus, or indeed to any national sickness more generally. It begins like this: follow the best available scientific advice. You have a responsibility of care towards yourself. You will remember that you have been lovingly made and your body is a temple to the Holy Spirit. And you have a responsibility toward your neighbour, especially those who are vulnerable. By following the best advice, you safeguard yourself and your neighbour. There may, of course, be a cost to this. It may mean washing your hands for the 9th time that day, despite the fact that they are dry and sore. It might mean isolating yourself after exposure and facing loneliness and loss of opportunity. And we hope that we as the Church can support you through these measures, but you must not contravene the guidance given by those who are best equipped to offer it. You might rightly say that there's nothing particularly, uniquely, specifically Christian about that. What does then make a distinctly Christian response? Well, one of the questions we might ask is, what have Christians done in the past? We have a letter remaining, an Easter letter as it is, of St. Dionysius of Alexandria. He was a 3rd century bishop, and he lived during a time of plague in the city. He writes that, "After all events, most of the brethren, through their love and brotherly affection for us, spared not themselves, nor abandoned one another, but without regard to their own peril, visited those who fell sick, diligently looking after and ministering to them, and cheerfully shared their fate with them, being infected with the disease from them, and willingly involving themselves in their troubles." He goes on, "Not a few also, after nursing others back to recovery, died themselves, taking death over from them. The very pick of our brethren lost their lives in this way, priests, deacons, some highly praised ones from among the laity. So that this manner of dying, being the outcome of much piety and stalwart faith." And he goes on to compare those who have died to Christ himself, saying that they took on the death that belonged to others. It wasn't just the Christians who wrote this. You might well think that that's exactly the sort of thing that a bishop would write. The following century, the Emperor Julian writes to complain bitterly of how these Galileans, those which are the name for the Christians at the time, how these Galileans would care even for the non-Christian sick people, and it was winning people over to their cause, and he didn't want any of that. And in fact, if you read some contemporary sociology, Rodney Stark, he sees 2 unique responses that the early church makes that others do not. He says that first, Christianity has a better answer to the question why than the other pagan religions of the time. The Christian answer is that the virus, the plague, the bacteria is not the work of angry and capricious deities battling one another in the skies, but instead the product of a broken creation in revolt against a loving God. God who, when he walked among us as Jesus Christ, healed those who came to him in need. God who has lived and has died as one of us, that the cycle of death might be broken. And so, following on from that belief, early Christians lived it out by demonstrating love and charity, by social service, by solidarity with one another and with the wider community. And he goes so far as to say, Rodney Stark, that he believes that Christian responses to plague were one of the principal reasons that Christianity flourished and became the dominant Western expression of faith. And that habit of sacrificial care has reappeared throughout history. In the 16th century, Martin Luther is in Wittenberg as it's hit by bubonic plague. There were calls upon him to flee the city and to protect himself, but rather he stayed and ministered to the sick. The refusal to flee cost the life of his daughter Elizabeth, but it produced a pamphlet which is still worth reading today, namely whether Christians should flee the plague. And Luther provides a clear articulation of the Christian epidemic response. He says, "We die at our posts. Christian doctors cannot abandon their hospitals. Christian governors cannot flee their districts. Christian pastors cannot abandon their congregations. The plague does not dissolve our duties, it turns them to crosses on which we must be prepared to die." You might be wondering, how does that match up with the advice that I offered at the beginning, the duty of care we have to ourselves and our neighbours? Well, we certainly do, and I'm not suggesting that you burst in on your isolating neighbours, or that if you show signs of fever, you battle on and appear in public places. Please don't do either of those things. But what I am saying is that you should consider whether actions that you might be taking now, or that you might think about taking in the future, are driven either by your fear of death and love of self, or whether they're driven by your care for your neighbour. Let me offer you a couple of examples. Christians should not stockpile to make sure that they have enough whilst food banks are running short. To do so would be to admit our fear of need is greater than our love for our neighbour. Luther puts it in quite stark terms. He says, "A man who will not help or support others unless he can do so without affecting his safety or his property will never help his neighbour. He will always reckon with the possibility that doing so will bring some disadvantage and danger, damage and loss." Another example, Christians should not leave sick neighbours behind whilst they seek out an unaffected area. To do so would be to admit that our fear of death is greater than our love for our neighbour. In such a case, don't expose yourself. I'm not suggesting that you go in and mop their brow in the midst of their fever, but offer to do the shopping, to make meals that you can leave outside a closed door, to be on the phone to them each day to check how they're doing. Our neighbours remain our responsibility until we are sure that they are being otherwise cared for, not the other way around. Don't wait to see whether someone else will offer aid before you do. The point that gathers all of these is this, that for the Christian, it is worse to face judgment for our unkindness or our lack of generosity than it is to face death. As we heard Paul speaking in the epistle, we rely on God who saves from the dead. We rely on God who has shown us in the example of Jesus Christ resurrection. We do not rely on our own strength, our own power. Death ought not to hold fear for us. As we repeat each week, as we have just said today, we believe in the resurrection from the dead and the life everlasting. This crisis in our nation and in our world is an opportunity for us to witness to the world by our living, and if it comes to it, by our dying. That is something which the Royal British Legion knows well, an opportunity to witness by our living, and if it comes to it, by our dying. That we are not afraid, that our love for our neighbour, whoever they may be, is not trumped by our love for ourselves. That we have followed Jesus Christ, who gave us an example of a better way to live. So take up your cross and follow him. Amen.